The night before the Phoenix project went public, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing violently on the nightstand. 3 words glowed on the screen, words that froze my blood. "Did you really think it was over?" I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the blinking light of my laptop across the desk, open, though I'd turned it off hours ago. The screen flickered to life on its own. A video began to play. It was me, standing on that same Miami beach, looking down from the motel window. Only this time, the footage wasn't from the camera I'd destroyed. Someone else had been filming. And at the edge of the frame, a shadow moved. A woman's silhouette. Then came the voice. Low, calm, venomous. "You can't kill a ghost, Ava. You only teach her how to haunt better." My phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud, but I barely heard it. My heart pounded so hard that every beat echoed in my head. Melissa's voice, smooth, amused, and chillingly familiar, lingered in the air like smoke. I stood frozen in the dark, staring at the glowing laptop screen as the video looped again. My reflection flickered over the image of that night on the beach, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which version of me was real, the terrified woman on the screen or the one standing here, haunted by the past she thought she'd buried. I forced myself to move, to breathe. I crossed the room and yanked the laptop's power cord out of the wall, but even as the screen went black, I could still hear the faint echo of her laugh. I knew every note of it, the way she used to laugh when she thought she had the upper hand, when she thought she'd won. But she was dead. She had to be. I'd watched the flames devour that warehouse. I'd stood in the pouring rain as the firefighters combed through the wreckage and declared there were no survivors. I'd buried that chapter of my life, her betrayal, the lies, the company she tried to destroy me with. So how the hell was she sending me videos now? My phone buzzed again. Another message. Same number. Unknown number. "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn." I stumbled back against the wall, my breath shallow and ragged. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't some hacker trying to scare me. No one else knew about that night, not in this detail. Whoever this was had been watching me for months, maybe years. I looked toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, staring in. The street below was empty, the only sound the faint hum of passing cars. But something in my gut whispered that she was close. I sank onto the bed and pressed a hand to my forehead. My thoughts raced. Melissa had always been ruthless, cunning, willing to manipulate anyone who stood in her way. If somehow she had survived, then she wouldn't just want revenge, she'd want to destroy me piece by piece. And the worst part? She was brilliant enough to do it. The next morning, the nightmare followed me into daylight. When I arrived at the office, everyone was whispering. Conversations stopped the moment I walked into the boardroom. My assistant looked pale, her eyes darting away from mine. "Is something wrong?" I asked, setting my bag on the table. She swallowed hard and hesitated before answering. You might want to see this." She turned her laptop around, and my stomach dropped. On the front page of Business Line Weekly was a headline that made my blood run cold. Phoenix founder Ava Morgan under investigation for corporate fraud. Below the headline was a photo of me, mid-laugh, at a charity gala. Beside it, an image of a forged document with my signature. My chest tightened. I hadn't signed anything like that. I knew immediately who was behind it. Melissa wasn't just haunting me anymore. She was building a noose around my neck. That night, I went through every file, every security camera, every encrypted message in my system. My team tried to assure me it was a smear campaign from a competitor, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The emails had timestamps that pointed back to my own login. Whoever was doing this wasn't outside my system. They were inside it. As I sat in my office, surrounded by glass walls and city lights, I realized the truth that made my skin crawl. Melissa hadn't just survived. She'd been planning this from the start. And if I wanted to stop her, I had to step into her world, the world I'd tried so hard to escape. I reached for my phone and called the one person I swore I'd never speak to again. A slow voice answered, rough with sleep and suspicion. "Ava Morgan," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." "I need your help," I said quietly. Melissa Kane is alive. A pause. Then a low whistle. Then you're already dead, unless we kill her first. I didn't flinch. Not this time. Because for the first time since the fire, I wasn't afraid. If Melissa wanted war, I was done playing defense. This time, I'd burn her world down to ashes. I didn't sleep that night. The video looped in my head like a threat. Asterisk, you can't kill a ghost, Ava. You only teach her how to haunt better. Asterisk, it felt less like taunt and more like a promise. Melissa's voice had the same velvet cruelty, the cadence of someone who'd spent years practicing how to wound without leaving a mark. By dawn, I'd called 3 people, Rachel, Martin, and Jonah, a cybersecurity consultant I'd hired during the trial, and then never let go. I needed someone who could prove the smear was manufactured, someone who could trace the fingerprints on the fake documents and the midnight logins that had framed my foundation. I needed someone who could tell me how deep this went. Jonah arrived with 2 hard drives and a tired look that meant he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of mess. He set up in the conference room like a field surgeon, connecting cables, tapping keys, pulling threads of code until a pattern emerged. It's not just one server, he said after the first hour, voice low. They spun a ghost network. Multiple VPN hops, proxies in 3 countries, then a final relay through a compromised node in our own cloud. Whoever did this wanted it to look like you did it yourself. That part made my stomach flip. It was one thing to be smeared, another to be set up with your own login credentials. Jonah's fingers flew. But this is sloppy, he added. They used a callback script that fired only when your IP was active. An inside job or someone who could spoof inside access. Melissa's handwriting on the note, Rachel said at my elbow. And yet she's dead. Or presumed dead. Either this is an incredibly elaborate hoax, or she survived and built an army of people willing to do her bidding. Either way, she's dangerous. I remembered the Polaroid from the dock, the hotel key on my desk. I remembered the red light under the dresser in room 14. That camera had recorded more than the motel receiver ever admitted. Whoever watched me then had watched for months. Pull the CCTV footage again, I told Jonah. Every camera on that block. Even private feeds. He nodded. Already on it. When the footage finally stitched together, we found what we'd suspected: brief flurries of faces, the glare of sunglasses, hands passing envelopes. Not one person we could directly ID, but the motion patterns matched a group I'd once seen at a charity gala, the finance brokers, the quiet men who clean up reputations. That same web of people had once buffered David. They still existed. They were useful to the desperate. It's not just Melissa, Jonah said finally. It's a network. She's the spark, but someone's been financing her. The question is who's paying her bills. Find the money, I said. Trace the transfers. If she's faking her death or living off hidden accounts, we'll find them. Days collapsed into a forensic blur. We subpoenaed logs, froze accounts, and placed discreet calls that made people who used to have power tuck their heads and move. Investors withdrew offers quietly, board members resigned, vendors sent nervous notes. The smear campaign's vector was drying up. But the videos didn't stop. More appeared, snippets of me leaving the office, my children at school, Rachel heading into her building. The threats escalated from reputational sabotage to psychological warfare. We filed police reports. We increased security. I stopped living in the penthouse for a week and slept at my brother's house. The maple shadow felt steadier than any alarm. Then Jonah found something that changed the shape of the fight, an IP address that didn't bounce. It was raw, real, and came from a registrar tied to a shell company registered in London, one with a name that made my gut twist. The domain records had been purchased with cash equivalents traced back, bizarrely, to an art auction house in Miami. A name flashed on the invoice that I recognized, Clara West, the alias from the hotel registry. The same name that checked in with David. She hadn't died on the beach. She'd created an illusion of death, a spectacular, public thing that made people close the book on her. And while they watched the flames, she used the smoke to slip away, to reinvent herself with new names, new channels, new proxies. She'd built a ghost network precisely so she could keep haunting me from somewhere no one would look. We had a lead. It was thin, but it was a thread. Jonah and the detective worked on it like surgeons. We did something I'd always sworn not to do. I reached out to David. He answered on the second ring, voice ragged, shock and shame sliding through every syllable. "She's alive," he said. "I told you. I was stupid. I thought I could control it. She's not the person I thought I knew." "Where?" I asked flatly. "Miami. Somewhere, north of South Beach. She uses boats. She's careful. She's not alone. Do you want to help, or do you want to keep watching women who relied on you now drown?" I asked. Silence. "Finally, I'll tell you everything." It wasn't an olive branch. It was a confession and a map. He rattled off names, middlemen, shell accounts, an ex-PR guy who liked fast cars and laundered money through charity galas. Each name was a nail we could hammer into the network. With that, we stopped chasing shadows and started closing doors. There were subpoenas, quiet raids, bank holds, a brilliantly mundane war of paperwork that felt like suturing an old wound. We found a courier service used to ferry cash in suitcases. We found an offshore mailbox that served as Melissa's virtual residence. And finally, after weeks of patient digging, an email bounced back to a server in an industrial district on the edge of Miami's marina. Jonah smiled once. "We have a place." We didn't storm the place. This wasn't a movie. It wasn't even the courtroom gladiator drama you see on TV. We planned like a chess player. We needed confirmation, not spectacle. On a humid morning, I flew to Miami in a small, tired plane. The city smelled of diesel and tourists and something dangerously expectant. The marina was a flat sheet of glass in the early light. The warehouse we found sat like a secret at the end of a low pier, corrugated metal and a single unassuming door. It could have been a fish market. Instead, inside, sat rows of monitors, hardware, a messy nest of servers, and a whiteboard scribbled in Melissa's hand, maps, names, dates. It was a command center for a ghost network. She was there. Not the woman from the pictures, but worn, older, hair scraped back, eyes still sharp enough to cut. Her face had the haggard look of someone who'd been close to something big and dangerous for too long, and had survived that crucible. When she saw me, she didn't flee. She walked over slowly, the act of coming toward me like an invitation to something final. "You followed the breadcrumbs," she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "I didn't think you had my patience." "I have more than you ever deserved," I replied. She laughed, not cruel now, but hollow, like tinkling glass. "You came to finish it, didn't you? To finally kill the ghost." "It's so theatrical." "I used to love theater." "You staged your own death," I said. "You ruined lives to disappear. You used my pain as a curtain." "Why? Why make yourself eternal by making others suffer?" "I could ask you the same," she said. "You turned your life into a brand. Phoenix. Rising. You tell women to fight. You made yourself into a story. We're both performers, Ava. Only our audiences differ. You made yourself into a story by burning things down," I said. "I rebuilt from what you tried to reduce to ash." She tilted her head. "You think rebuilding is better? Being remembered as the woman who rebuilt? That's vanity carved into a mission statement." Something inside me, a memory of long nights, of small humiliations, of decisions I'd made so my children wouldn't go hungry, made my voice low. Rebuilding isn't about being remembered. It's about making it harder for predators to hide in the guise of love and business. Her eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop me?" "No," I said. "I think I can end your ability to hurt people." We talked then, not in the shrill way people imagine confrontations to be, but in a quiet, terrible exchange where every paragraph was a detonator. She confessed in a way, not the details of how she'd faked the fire, too messy and too likely to incriminate the remaining networks, but the shape of her plan. She admitted to buying silence with favors and cash, to hiring mortgage brokers to move property and PR men to rewrite the past. She said it like it was a ledger of achievements. "You were always so sure of yourself," she said finally. "Did you really think you were the only woman who could do what I did?" "I never wanted what you had," I said. "I wanted my life back." She paused, and for just a blink, some bewildered, human thing crossed her face. "You look tired," she said. "Yes," I told her. "I am." Then I did something I hadn't planned, and I think that unnerved her more than any legal threat. I sat down at a dusty table and opened my notebook, the one I'd kept since the beginning, the one that had every email, every call log, every breadcrumb I'd saved. I slid it across. "You kept a ledger?" she asked, incredulous. "I kept a life," I corrected. "And in that life, you're a part. Not the last chapter. Not the headline." She laughed, this time a small, incredulous sound. "You brought witnesses? Detectives? Financial forensics?" "No," I said. "You brought yourself. That matters. Confession looks different when it's spoken rather than leaked." She sighed and leaned back. "You're naive." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm done letting you shape me." The police arrived 20 minutes later. Not from some grand plan of mine. I'd told Detective Hayes where I'd be, but with the precise, patient force of men who'd watched too many predators move too freely for their discomfort. They cuffed her, not with the sound of triumph in their voices, but with the calm of people doing their job. As she was led away, Melissa didn't scream or plead. She looked at me as if cataloging the moment like another victory. "You'll never be happy," she said. "You'll always worry someone will return to pull you down." "Maybe," I said. But worry's not the same thing as being controlled. Back in the light, as they closed the warehouse doors and the marina breathed its slow sigh, I realized something that had been buried under adrenaline and fury. Revenge is loud, but closure is quiet. I'd wanted both at different times in this story. The revenge had saved me from silence and from being invisible. Closure felt like an everyday thing, making sure no more women lost their homes to a man who traded on charm, making sure a charity I'd built could survive, making sure my children could go to school without whispers in the playground. We prosecuted the network in stages. Papers were served in different cities. Men who'd been invisible until now found their names in filings. That was the part of revenge the world likes, the clickbait headlines of felonies and indictments. But the quieter work mattered more. I restructured the foundation to be transparent to a fault. We created escrow accounts audited by independent trustees. I pounded a stake into the ground, proof that systems can be changed. Months later, they tried appeals and motions. They hired lawyers who were prettier on TV than in courtrooms. They leaked what they could. But a network is a fragile thing. Once one string is cut, the tension moves elsewhere until it snaps. At the opening of the first Phoenix Project Recovery Center, the converted penthouse that used to belong to Melissa, I stood in the lobby and watched women walk in whose lives read like my past. They arrived with duffel bags and quiet desperation. Volunteers met them with hot coffee and legal referrals. A sign in the lobby read, "This is a place to relearn trust." I felt the heaviness of it like heat. I didn't take a final, cinematic victory lap. There was no gavel struck in slow motion. What I had instead were small things, a letter from a woman who had left an abusive partner after reading something I'd said online, my son's schoolteacher telling me gently that my kids were sleeping better, Marcus handing me a stack of pro bono contracts from firms that wanted to protect other women. Those things studied me more than headlines ever could. One rainy afternoon, as I was closing files in my office, Rachel slid a small envelope across my desk. Inside was a single Polaroid. A photo of the marina, taken from a distance, a boat tied to the pier. On the back, written in tiny, hurried handwriting, "You were right to come." I put the photo in my notebook and closed it. The idea of ghosts has a power because we give them one, attention. Melissa had tried to make herself eternal by burning and running and smearing. She'd tried to make my life an echo of her wrath. But I'd learned something else in the long, brutal arc of the story. You do not have to listen to every echo. The Phoenix Project grew. It spread to other cities. We put resources into forensic accounting scholarships and partnered with law clinics. We published a handbook for survivors about financial abuse and coercion. Women who'd once been invisible on domestic budgets now had tools, legal, practical, emotional, to make sure their property and choices could not be re-engineered by someone else's greed. Sometimes at night, I still wake up to the thin sting of memory. There are moments, a smell, a sound, the clatter of rain on the window, that pull me back. But the fear that used to live under my skin has become a kind of muscle memory. It tightens when needed but doesn't bind me. Years later, when the headlines about David's final bankruptcy filings fade into the archives and Melissa's name becomes a footnote rather than a ghost story, I stand at a podium in a modest room and read a letter from a woman whose life was saved because someone refused to look away. She wrote, "Asterisk, you taught me to count my money, to sign a contract, and to set a password that even men I loved couldn't guess. You taught me that the house my father left me is not a bargaining chip. You taught me how to be unghostable. Asterisk, I fold the letter carefully and tuck it into my notebook." Outside, the maple tree we planted years ago is pushing green through the thaw. The city hums, not with scandal but with the ordinary clatter of people living lives that are their own. I once thought revenge would look like fire. It looked, in the end, like light, steady, slow, and stubborn enough to make a new thing grow in the ashes. The night before the confrontation, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled against the windows, carrying whispers of everything I had endured, every insult, every manipulation, every time he made me feel small. The papers I had collected over the past few weeks lay on the desk beside me, sealed in a neat envelope that could destroy him completely. But I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to pull the trigger, or if I wanted to watch him destroy himself first. My heart raced as I thought of the way he used to look at me in the beginning, with admiration and warmth. Now those eyes held only greed and calculation. Somewhere between our wedding vows and his last cruel demand, he had turned into a stranger wearing my husband's face. I wasn't just fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for every piece of dignity he had stripped away. The next morning, I walked into the dining room wearing the calmest expression I could muster. My hands were steady, my voice smooth as I greeted him with a casual, "Good morning." He didn't notice the shift in me. He didn't see the quiet storm brewing behind my polite smile. That was the thing about him, he never believed I could outthink him. He saw me as fragile, emotional, and naive. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him had already outplayed his entire game. He started his usual morning lecture about family responsibilities and how a good wife supports her husband's ambitions. I let him speak, even poured him coffee while he went on about how my brothers were wasting the property that should have been ours. I watched his mouth move, words dripping with entitlement, and something inside me finally snapped. "You keep talking about my family's property," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "But you seem to forget, you don't have any of your own." He looked up, startled, clearly not used to being challenged. "What did you just say?" I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You heard me. For someone who married for love, you spend a lot of time trying to own what isn't yours." His face hardened, and for the first time in months, he didn't have a ready response. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. "You told me to get a portion for my brothers or leave. Maybe it's time you consider leaving instead." That's when I dropped the first document onto the table, bank statements showing the missing funds from our joint account, the ones he thought I'd never find. He blinked, then frowned, his confidence faltering. I didn't stop. One by one, I laid out the evidence, his secret transactions, his meetings with a realtor, his fake promises to investors. Every lie he'd told, I had turned into proof. "You see," I said quietly, "while you were busy plotting how to use me, I was learning how to read between your lies." The silence that followed was suffocating. He looked at me like I'd turned into someone unrecognizable. Maybe I had. The woman who once cried herself to sleep was gone. The one sitting before him now was composed, dangerous, and done playing nice. "I'll give you a choice," I continued, sliding the final envelope toward him. "You can walk away quietly, or I can let everyone, including your business partners, see who you really are." He opened the envelope with shaking hands, scanning the papers. His face drained of color as the weight of what I'd done settled in. "You wouldn't dare," he whispered. I tilted my head. "Wouldn't I? You dared to ask me to betray my family for money. You dared to make me feel worthless. You dared to treat love like a transaction. So yes, I would." He pushed back his chair violently and stormed out of the room. I didn't move. The sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway felt like music, a rhythm of fear and defeat. I knew it wasn't over yet. He'd fight back, cornered men always do. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the fight. Because now I had the upper hand. That night, as I stood by the window, I saw him pacing in the yard, phone in hand, no doubt calling his lawyer, trying to find a way to twist things back in his favor. But he didn't know I had already spoken to mine. He didn't know that the house we lived in, his so-called achievement, was now legally under my name, transferred discreetly weeks ago through a trust I'd set up using my inheritance. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. As the moonlight spilled across the floor, I realized that revenge didn't always come with shouting or chaos. Sometimes, it came in the quiet moment when your enemy realized they'd lost everything they once controlled. Tomorrow, I'd set the final plan in motion. The trap was ready. And this time, when he tried to take from me, he'd end up losing far more than he ever imagined. I didn't sleep that night. Sleep felt like surrender. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the lines of evidence I'd assembled: bank transfers, doctored invoices, timestamps, a handful of voice memos where his own words looped back on him. The trap wasn't some dramatic spectacle. It was a slow, surgical constriction. I wanted to make sure every move I made now could survive the glare of a courtroom and the hunger of a newsroom. Morning came like a held breath released. I signed the final affidavits, then called the people who mattered: Martin to file the motion, Jonah to lock down the tech trail, Detective Hayes to coordinate timing with the federal agents, and Rachel to prepare the press. Everything had to be simultaneous: legal pressure, public clarity, and financial containment. Predator networks collapse fastest when all three legs of the stool are kicked out from under them at once. We moved with the quiet choreography of professionals who knew how to kill a story before it could be dressed up again. The first strike was paperwork, a sealed civil complaint filed in the jurisdiction where the shell companies had been incorporated. That document named names, supplied evidence, and demanded immediate forensic actions. The second strike was financial, an emergency petition to freeze accounts tied to David's front companies and the offshore nodes that had been laundering cash. The third was public, a controlled leak to a journalist we trusted, one who wouldn't sensationalize but would present facts in a way the public could understand. When the news hit, it wasn't a roar, it was a cascade. Headlines listed the charges. Partners who had tolerated rumors suddenly wanted distance. Lenders pulled lines of credit. Men who'd once brushed me off as a private wife now called my attorney asking what they could do to help. That was the beautiful ugliness of it. The very social scaffolding David relied on to feel untouchable was the first to shudder and fall. He tried to fight. Of course he did. In the days that followed, there were frantic calls, threats thin as tissue paper, last-ditch offers of hush money. He tried the old playbook: charm, apology, performative grief. He reached out to mutual friends, hoping someone would whisper that I was unreasonable, that my demands were cruel. But the script had changed. People who once took his side had read the filings. They heard his own handwriting on the ledger. They saw where the money went. Sympathy evaporated. The actual moment the net closed wasn't cinematic. No handcuffs, no dramatic courtroom shout. It was a hum of legal engines. Agents served warrants in several cities. A bank account was frozen in the middle of the night. A trustee was appointed to hold assets in escrow while prosecutors parsed the evidence. The law is a slow machine, but when it runs, it is relentless. The day they brought him into the federal building, it was raining in that small, steady way that makes everything feel like it's being washed clean. He looked at me as they passed, not with anger, but with the flatness of a man watching the scaffolding of his life disassemble. There were no words exchanged beyond that look. I didn't want to speak to him. I wanted to see what justice looks like without theater. The cameras snapped. Some people cheered from the sidewalk. I felt none of it as triumph. I felt only the tight, cold relief of closure moving into place. Melissa's arrest came later, but it came. She had been clever in her reinvention, slipping behind proxies and buying anonymity with forged IDs and ghost accounts. She'd built a small army of enablers, brokers who courted risk for a cut, PR men who could spin almost anything, and lawyers who could draft obfuscation like it was poetry. But paranoia makes conspiracies brittle. Someone trips, someone confesses, someone wants out. Once one node turned, the rest followed like dominoes. She was taken in a sleepy coastal town where she'd tried to live under a different name. She looked at me as they led her past, and for a split second I saw exhaustion that wasn't performance. It was the same hollowness I'd watched in David the first time I caught him lying. What I did after people started using the word vindication surprised even me. I refused interviews for a week. I let others tell the story of evidence and indictments. I wanted the reclaimed quiet to hold. But I couldn't sit idly by as the aftermath unfolded. The women whose savings had been siphoned, the families left scrambling when investments vanished, the charitable programs gutted by false donations. That's when the Phoenix Project stopped being just a symbol and became an obligation. We used the frozen assets to seed a recovery fund. We hired pro bono lawyers and forensic accountants and set up a legal clinic that specialized in disentangling financial abuse from the tangle of marriage, business, and coercion. Women called in, hesitant at first, then relieved as someone finally knew the language of their loss and had the tools to fight back. The first woman we helped recover had lost her family home because of a shell company set up by her ex's brother. Watching her sign papers that meant she could keep the house, I understood in a new way how much the work mattered. Months later, the biggest, quietest victory happened in a courtroom where nobody expected fireworks. The judge signed an order permanently enjoining both David and Melissa from holding fiduciary positions and ordered restitution schedules. The legalese is never sexy on paper, but its effects are material. Frozen assets released to victims, forced dissolution of the fraudulent entities, and monitoring of finances to prevent a repeat. It was bureaucratic, slow, and perfectly final. People asked me afterward what I'd felt when the judge's pen met paper. I don't have a tidy line for that. I felt peace, not the giddy blaze revenge promises, but a low-burning steadiness that allowed me to sleep without waking in a cold sweat. The house felt like a home again. The kids' laughter returned to rooms that had held arguments like a bad smell. My brothers stopped glancing over their shoulders when a family friend walked by. They exhaled, and when relatives hugged me, the embrace felt like an amnesty. He tried one last thing, a lawsuit alleging that my public statements falsely damaged him and that I had orchestrated a smear campaign. I sat through the deposition the way one endures a bad play patient, knowing the script and waiting for the curtain. His counsel waved dramatic hypotheticals and hypothetical motives. My counsel responded with documents, recorded deposits, email trails, contract copies. The judge dismissed the complaint, and sanctions were imposed against his lawyer for filing frivolous claims. It was a small detail in a long afterword, but it made a point. Truth becomes a fortress when you build it with evidence, not noise. After all that, the Phoenix Project ceremonies were not ostentatious. We converted Melissa's penthouse into a resource center not to gloat, but to rehouse the energy she'd burned for spectacle into something that mended. The reception was small. Volunteers, a few reporters, the first cohort of women who would receive grants. I gave a short speech without bravado. I said what I meant, that healing is not a tournament to be won in public, but a steady work of living well and of preventing predators from repeating their schemas. The applause that followed felt like a closing bell in the best way possible. On quieter nights, I still replay small moments in my head, the way he asked me to betray my brothers, his voice like flint, the first time I read an email that proved his duplicity, the moment I chose to stop being afraid. I don't romanticize revenge. It can leach you dry if you let it become your identity. What mattered was that I'd transformed that energy into something durable. I'd shifted from being someone who reacted to being someone who shaped outcomes. People still approach me in the grocery store or at school pickup and say, "You were brave." I don't correct them. Bravery is a useful adjective for other people. What I try to say is simpler. I was persistent. Courage without persistence doesn't change systems. It only changes reputations. I wanted systems changed so that my children and other children could inherit lives that belong to them, not to manipulative adults who confuse affection with ownership. Years later, when the maple we planted the year after the trial cast shade over a yard full of bike tracks and laundry lines, I noticed how ordinary life had settled in like a comfortable garment. The maple's leaves turned gold and then released. The seasons passed in a reliable rotation. The house creaked the way old houses do, a sound that once made me flinch and now made me smile. One afternoon, my son ran past with paint on his shirt, laughing, and I thought, this is the best kind of revenge, the long, patient reclamation of a life that stays gentle and ordinary because you guarded it. I kept the notebook, the ledger of small humiliations and hard evidence, but I no longer opened it to rehearse wounds. It lived on a shelf like a tool, useful when necessary, otherwise tucked away. Sometimes I signed a check for a scholarship, answered an email from a woman just starting the process of disentanglement, or sat in a small legal clinic where a new volunteer taught clients how passwords and joint accounts can be sources of power rather than vulnerability. When people ask me how they should fight, I tell them three simple things: document everything, build alliances quietly, and remember your life is not a prop in someone else's ambition. You don't have to be loud to be formidable. You don't have to burn to be seen. If you want an ending that lasts, build one that can stand on its own. In the end, the story wasn't about the men who tried to own me. It was about the architecture I built afterward: legal structures, accountability, community resources, and a politics of small things that makes predation expensive. That was the real victory, not a headline, not a moralistic gavel, but the slow, mundane work that ensures predatory patterns have fewer places to hide. On a bright morning years later, as I walked past the Foundation's small campus on a street that smelled of coffee and cut grass, a woman I didn't know caught my eye. She mouthed thank you, a small gesture loaded with history. I nodded. It felt like the simplest, truest applause. The days that followed my final victory didn't feel like the fireworks people imagine when they think of revenge. They felt eerily quiet, like the world had exhaled after years of holding its breath. I would wake up before sunrise out of habit, half expecting the knot of dread in my stomach, the one that had lived there since David first raised his voice in that cold, clipped tone that meant trouble. But the knot was gone. I could breathe again. I walked through my house barefoot, the sound of the hardwood floor creaking under my steps, sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains. This house, once filled with tension and whispered arguments, finally belonged to peace. There were no secret phone calls, no locked doors, no falsified invoices left carelessly on the counter. Just me, a pot of coffee, and a long list of things I wanted to do with the rest of my life. One of those things was to make sure no one else lived the same nightmare I had survived. That idea had started as a small ember, a wish whispered to myself during the trial when I sat at the back of the courtroom, watching other women testify about financial manipulation, gaslighting, and betrayal. So many of them didn't have the resources or courage I'd been lucky enough to find. Their stories haunted me. So I turned that ember into action. With the money I reclaimed through the settlement, funds that once lined David's pockets, I launched an initiative under the Phoenix Project umbrella called the Second Ledger. It was a financial literacy and recovery program for women escaping manipulative relationships or unfair business entanglements. The name came from something David himself once said smugly during a dinner party: asterisk, there's always a second ledger if you know where to look. Asterisk, he meant it as a secret of deceit. I turned it into a banner for transparency. The project grew faster than I expected. Lawyers volunteered their weekends. Accountants trained survivors on how to detect hidden transfers, how to read fine print, how to reclaim what was theirs. Soon, small groups started forming in other cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, Austin, where women met in coffee shops, shared stories, swapped advice, and built networks of mutual protection. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was evolution. David, meanwhile, had disappeared from the spotlight. The empire he built had disintegrated. What was left of his name now circulated only in legal filings and news archives. I didn't check on him often, but once in a while his name would surface in an article, usually attached to a failed appeal or another civil suit. He'd lost his mansion, most of his assets, and, according to a reporter's note, even his health had begun to deteriorate under stress. There was a time when I would have smiled at that. But standing in front of the mirror one morning, brushing my hair and looking at the faint scars of old battles etched around my eyes, I realized I didn't want vengeance anymore. What I wanted was balance, and that balance had already been restored. I did, however, get one last taste of poetic irony. A few months later, I was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a national business ethics conference in New York. The topic? Corporate accountability and the cost of concealed power. The organizers didn't know that the examples I planned to share were built from my own scars. As I stood on the stage, lights blazing, the room filled with hundreds of faces, executives, lawyers, journalists, I saw him. David. He was sitting near the back, looking older, smaller somehow. His once perfect posture was hunched, and his suit didn't quite fit right anymore. I could see the faint glint of bitterness in his eyes when he realized I'd seen him. But I didn't pause. I didn't falter. I began my speech. Accountability, I said, isn't a punishment. It's the price of power. Those who build success by deception forget that truth is a patient accountant. It always collects. The audience leaned forward, spellbound. I spoke for 40 minutes about transparency, about abuse of trust, about how silence enables cruelty. Every word came not from vengeance, but from experience, carved in the fire of everything I'd endured. When I finished, the applause was deafening. People stood, clapping, some even cheering. David didn't. He stayed seated, staring down at the program in his hands. I didn't need to say anything to him. My existence, my strength, my transformation was the loudest answer I could ever give. After that day, I never saw him again. But sometimes, late at night, when I sat by the window with a glass of wine, I thought about how small his world must have become. How the man who once demanded that I steal from my brothers just to appease his ego now had no one left to manipulate. Meanwhile, mine had only expanded. My brothers and I rebuilt our bond stronger than ever. We started a joint investment venture together, one built on honesty and shared goals, a living symbol of what David had tried to destroy. Mom, once too afraid to take sides, finally apologized with tears in her eyes, telling me she'd never realized how cruel his influence had been. Life, I learned, doesn't hand out justice automatically. You have to dig your hands into the soil and shape it yourself. Years passed, and one afternoon I got an email from a journalist who was writing a follow-up about financial fraud survivors. She said she'd interviewed several women who credited me for helping them reclaim their lives. They called me the quiet storm, the woman who fought back without ever screaming. I smiled at that. It fit. Because revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it builds hospitals, scholarships, and foundations. Sometimes it simply stands tall when those who tried to crush it can no longer stand at all. The last entry I made in my journal about David was simple. He thought he could break me. Instead, he built me. I closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and never opened it again. Years later, as the Phoenix Project celebrated its 10th anniversary, I stood before a crowd of hundreds, women, men, survivors, entrepreneurs, all of them clapping, all of them living proof that healing can be louder than pain. I looked around and felt something deeper than triumph. Peace. That's what victory really was. Not destroying your enemies, but building a life so whole that their absence feels like freedom. And in that moment, as flashbulbs flickered and the audience rose to their feet, I knew I'd done it. I hadn't just survived. I'd rewritten the ending. When the applause faded that night, I lingered on the stage for a moment longer than I should have. The lights dimmed, and people began filing out into the soft hum of chatter. But I stood there, staring at the empty seats, remembering who I used to be, the frightened woman who once sat in the back row of a courtroom, clutching her hands together as if holding herself from breaking apart. That woman would never have believed she'd end up here, commanding a room, shaping conversations about justice and power, inspiring others who had been silenced for too long. After the event, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she handed me a folded note. "You don't know me," she said, "but your story saved my life. I was in a relationship like yours. He made me believe I was worthless. But after watching your interview last year, I found the courage to leave." I unfolded the note later in the hotel room. It simply said, "Asterisk, thank you for proving that we don't have to stay broken." Asterisk, that night, I cried for the first time in years, not from pain, but from the quiet ache of recognition. Every bruise I had hidden, every night I'd cried into a pillow so no one would hear, it had all led to this moment of connection. Healing, I realized, isn't a single act. It's a legacy that grows in others. Months passed, and my life took on a new rhythm, one I chose, not one imposed on me. I moved to a smaller town by the coast, somewhere between San Francisco and Carmel. My home overlooked the ocean, and every morning, I'd open the windows to the scent of salt and wild rosemary. I'd brew a strong cup of coffee, wrap a shawl around my shoulders, and watch the waves crash like time itself, relentless, cleansing, inevitable. One morning, as I was scrolling through my emails, I saw a familiar name. David. My chest tightened for a split second, the reflex of old trauma, but curiosity won out. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." For a moment, I considered deleting it. But I didn't. The email was short, almost painfully so. He wrote that he was struggling, that his new ventures had failed, that he'd lost the respect of everyone he once commanded. He said he'd realized how wrong he'd been, how blind. That he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped I could at least acknowledge that he was trying to become a better person. I stared at those words for a long time. Once, I would have written back immediately out of anger or pity or a lingering sense of duty. But now, I simply closed the laptop and walked to the balcony. The sea roared below, endless and indifferent. That's when it hit me, I didn't need to respond. Some stories don't need closure. Some lessons are meant to echo unanswered. A few days later, I visited my family. My brothers, who once doubted me, now treated me like a force of nature. We sat on the porch drinking iced tea, talking about business, about life, about how far we'd all come. When I told them about David's message, my youngest brother laughed. "So now he wants your forgiveness?" "After all he did." I smiled softly. "He doesn't want forgiveness," I said. "He wants relevance. And that he'll never get again." We all laughed, but inside, I felt something even more satisfying than laughter, peace mixed with finality. Years later, my story became part of a documentary series about women rebuilding their lives after financial and emotional abuse. I wasn't sure if I wanted to participate at first, but the producer convinced me. "You're not telling your story," she said. "You're telling every woman's story who's ever been told she's less than she is." Filming took weeks. Cameras followed me through my foundation office, the beach house, and even an old courtroom where my battle with David had begun. At one point, the interviewer asked, "If you could say one thing to the woman you were before all this, what would it be?" I paused, looking into the lens, seeing the reflection of who I had become. "I'd tell her," I said quietly, "that pain is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of your power." When the documentary aired, it went viral. Messages poured in from around the country, women, men, even teenagers, thanking me for being vulnerable, for speaking truth in a world that often demands silence. The Phoenix Project gained even more recognition. Donations doubled overnight. But none of that compared to the moment I received a handwritten letter from a woman in her 60s. She said she had stayed in a loveless marriage for 40 years because she was too afraid to start over. After watching my story, she finally left. Her last line read, "I may not have your youth, but I finally have my freedom." I framed that letter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ocean horizon, I found myself thinking of that first day, the day David told me to take a share from my brother's property or leave the home. I remembered the sting of betrayal, the humiliation, the fear. It all seemed like another lifetime. Now I live surrounded by light and laughter. My house smelled like cinnamon and coffee instead of tension and dread. My phone buzzed not with threats or manipulations, but with invitations, opportunities, gratitude. And sometimes, when I saw my reflection in the glass, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back, confident, calm, unbreakable. I realized that revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about reclamation. Reclaiming your dignity, your peace, your story. And in reclaiming mine, I'd helped others find theirs too. The final twist of fate came a few years later when the magazine Forbes Women invited me to be featured on their Leaders Who Rose from the Ashes issue. The interview headline read, "From Betrayal to Boardroom: How One Woman Turned Her Ex-Husband's Greed into a Global Mission." When the issue hit stands, I stood in front of a bookstore window, watching strangers pick it up. My face smiled back at me from the glossy cover, not as a victim, but as a symbol of reinvention. Behind me, I heard someone say, "Is that her?" followed by a whisper of admiration. I smiled and walked away, the breeze carrying my hair and the faint scent of salt water. Because finally, I didn't need anyone to recognize me. I had recognized myself. And that, more than any courtroom victory, any headline, or any apology, was the sweetest revenge of all. The evening wind carried the scent of the ocean, mingling with the distant sound of laughter from the beach below. I sat by the open window, a cup of tea in my hands, staring out at the horizon where the sky melted into gold and violet. My world had changed beyond recognition, not suddenly, but through 1,000 small, defiant choices. Every so often, my mind drifted back to the woman I once was, the one who flinched at raised voices, who second-guessed her worth, who thought love meant endurance. That version of me still lived somewhere inside, a shadow of memories. But now she was no longer trapped. She watched quietly from a safe distance as I built a life she once didn't dare to dream of. It had been 3 years since I walked out of that house, the house where I was told I didn't belong unless I brought something to the table that wasn't my heart. I still remembered the sound of the door closing behind me. It wasn't just wood meeting metal. It was the sound of a chapter ending, a cage opening, a life unpausing. In the years that followed, I learned that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It breathes. It grows roots deep within your silence. Mine did. The first whisper of my revenge came when I registered my business under my own name. I remember standing in that office, signing papers with trembling hands. The lawyer smiled politely, unaware that every stroke of my pen was a quiet rebellion, every signature a declaration: I am free. The next whisper came when my brand began to grow, when clients started calling me Mrs. Stone again, not because of my husband's name, but because of the reputation I built. I still remember the first time a major investor called me inspiring. The word felt foreign at first, almost too heavy. Inspiring? Me? But it stayed. It lingered. It healed. When I walked into corporate rooms now, men who once dismissed me as someone's wife rose to shake my hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same world that once demanded I be smaller was now leaning forward to listen. My brothers, who had initially doubted my decisions, became my biggest supporters. They apologized in their own quiet ways, by showing up, by helping with my projects, by reminding me that family could heal too. I forgave them not because they deserved it, but because I needed peace more than pride. Then came the day I was invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship conference in New York. The invitation letter had my name printed in bold across the top: Lena Stone, founder and CEO, The Phoenix Project. The name of my company wasn't a coincidence. The phoenix, after all, is a creature that burns before it flies. The night before my speech, I barely slept. My mind replayed everything: the humiliation, the fear, the betrayal. But by morning, when I stepped onto the stage and saw hundreds of women waiting to hear my story, something inside me clicked. The fear dissolved. I began not with statistics or success stories, but with truth. 3 years ago, I told them, I was told I didn't deserve a home unless I brought money from my family. Today, I own 3. The room erupted into applause, but I didn't pause. I kept speaking about courage, about failure, about starting over with nothing but willpower. When I finished, women lined up to talk to me, some crying, some just holding my hand. One whispered, "You gave me permission to begin again." That night, I realized my revenge had already bloomed into something much larger than me. But fate, as it often does, had one more twist waiting. 6 months later, I received a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it until I saw the name. David. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Lena, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you that you were right. About everything. I lost everything trying to chase what I thought mattered. If I could go back, I'd choose you, not for your family's money, but for your strength. You were always the real thing. The message ended with a simple line, I hope you're happy now. I laughed softly, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. Happiness? It was too small a word for what I had built. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there, a digital ghost, a reminder that karma sometimes uses silence as its sharpest blade. A few months after that, a gossip site ran an article titled, Once Power Couple, David Stone's empire collapses amid allegations. The headline was poetic in a way only life can be. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My success spoke louder than any tabloid ever could. One evening, after the article went viral, my assistant knocked on my office door. Lena, there's someone waiting to see you. I looked up surprised. At this hour? She nodded. He says he's an old friend. When I stepped out, I saw him older, thinner, the spark of arrogance replaced by exhaustion. David. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The memories, the hurt, the betrayal, they all stood between us like ghosts. He looked at me, his voice trembling. You look different. I am, I said simply. He glanced around my office, the awards on the wall, the framed photos of charity events, the newspaper clippings. You did well, he said. No, I replied, I did better. He tried to smile, but it faltered. I just wanted to say sorry, in person. I don't expect anything. I know, I said softly. And that's why I can forgive you. He looked stunned. You can? Yes, I said. Because forgiving you doesn't mean forgetting what you did. It means I've outgrown it. There was silence then, not uncomfortable, but final. He nodded slowly and turned to leave. When the door closed behind him, I felt nothing but relief. Not victory. Not triumph. Just peace. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, the best revenge is not making them suffer. It's making them irrelevant. Years passed. My foundation expanded internationally. I became a mentor, a speaker, a name people associated with resilience. My story was turned into a film, not about heartbreak, but about rebirth. Sometimes, I'd get letters from women who said my journey gave them courage. Some of them even signed their letters, from one phoenix to another. And every time I read those words, I felt that same flame, the one that had once burned me, now lighting the way for others. So when people asked me how I survived, I always smiled and said, I didn't just survive. I began. And that, the choice to begin again, to turn betrayal into brilliance, was the greatest revenge of all.